Going into the 1968 California Democratic primary, the Democratic nomination was up for grabs. While many nowadays assume that it was Bobby Kennedy's for the taking, nothing could be further from the truth. Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy, who finished a strikingly strong second place in New Hampshire behind President Lyndon Johnson, continued to perform well in primaries and state conventions. Just 1 week before the California primary, McCarthy would win the Oregon primary by 6%. But still, primaries were only part of the story. Delegates to the convention were, in many cases, controlled by state Democratic parties. This gave Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who essentially was Johnson's replacement candidate, a huge advantage as state parties were still loyal to the incumbent administration. Even with that being the case, many states didn't like Bobby Kennedy, mostly because he was President Kennedy's legal pit bull. But if Kennedy were to win the California primary, whose delegates were connected to that primary, with the winner taking all of California's delegates, then he would be in a strong position for the Democratic nomination. Kennedy would be declared the winner on primary night, but as he was leaving the Ambassador Hotel ballroom in Los Angeles, California,
Ladies and gentlemen, we've kept the air on because we've heard an alarming report that Robert Kennedy was shot in that ballroom at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. A very loud noise like a clap of thunder was heard, a small explosion. We waited to see what it was, and then came a report that Senator Robert Kennedy was shot. We will bring you more news as we learn it. So far, that's all the information we have.
hello, my name is Dave and welcome to Election History. I worked in politics for over 30 years and have a master's degree from McGill University in political science. If you like videos about campaigns, elections, candidates, political parties, and the likes, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. If you would like to help out a little more, you can become a supporter of mine on Patreon with the link in the description below. Here is a list of all of my current Patreon members. This week on Patreon, I'm going to do a poll about upcoming videos that Patreon members can vote on. And with that, let's move on to today's video. Many say that the Vietnam War was the reason for the Johnson administration being so unpopular. And while this is true in some respects, it isn't entirely the case. In the 1966 midterm elections, Republicans dominated, kind of. Republicans gained 47 seats in the House of Representatives and 3 seats in U.S. Senate, though the Democrats retained control of both chambers. While many assumed that the Democrats were losing Southern votes because of the changing view of civil rights in the party, that really wasn't the case. Most of the seats that the Democrats lost were in the West, Industrial Midwest, and Northeast. Basically, many of the seats that the Democrats won in 1964 Lyndon Johnson landslide just went back to the Republicans, with former members of Congress being elected to their old seats. In the former Confederacy, the Republicans only gained 8 seats, while the Democrats won back 4 seats that they lost in 1964 when Goldwater performed well in the South. In fact, most of those gains in the Republican areas in the South were in urban areas such as Broward County, Florida, Metro Atlanta, and the Houston area, which elected George Herbert Walker Bush to Congress. Also, the Republicans picked up a congressional district in Arkansas, which I talk about more in depth in this video. Remember, at this time, the situation in Vietnam was in the news, but it wasn't what led to the Democrats' defeat. In many cases, we saw the first nationwide rejection of the civil rights and voting rights laws that had been passed. And it wasn't necessarily that people were opposed to the legislation, but that white working class voters felt like that they were being rejected. This was further compounded by the passing of the Great Society, a series of legislation that addressed helping low-income Americans. For many white voters, they saw this as benefits for black Americans, but not for them. In fact, Republicans would campaign on this dissatisfaction in 1966, which would eventually become part of their Southern strategy in 1968. But as the Democratic primaries approached in 1968, the Vietnam situation, now referred to as a war by many and not just a police action, saw hundreds of Americans come home weekly in body bags. And as the war escalated, many liberals who had supported the liberal social and economic policies of the Great Society started to look at alternatives to Johnson in 1968. Essentially, the electoral coalition that saw Johnson dominate in 1964 was now starting to fall apart in front of him. With that, let's move on to the subject of our video, which is Robert Kennedy. Of course, Kennedy was Attorney General under his brother, President John F. Kennedy. He would go on to serve in that same position after his brother's assassination, but would eventually leave in 1964. During the 1964 election, many assumed that Kennedy would be Johnson's running mate as it would create a unified and popular ticket. Many advocated Bobby to be the vice presidential candidate, but both Johnson and Kennedy couldn't stand each other. While the tensions between JFK and LBJ were somewhat cool, the relationship between RFK and the president was ice cold. Of course, a lot of this had to do with policy, but according to many RFK observers, it mostly had to do with both a personal dislike between the men as well as Johnson immediately trying to shape the presidency in his image and not that of John F. Kennedy. Kennedy's time as Attorney General would eventually affect his presidential run in 1968. Back in the 1960s, a lot of Democratic politicians were closely connected to organized crime. Kennedy went after many in organized crime, which angered many in Democratic circles. For example, the Nevada delegation, which had a lot of casino influence, detested Kennedy because he went after casinos because of organized crime being involved with their operations. Still, 1964 was a turning point for Kennedy. First, at the Democratic National Convention, Kennedy introduced a film about his brother on the last day of the convention. When he was introduced, the crowd gave a standing ovation for 22 minutes. Interestingly, the reason why Kennedy spoke on the last day was that Johnson was worried that if Kennedy gave a speech early in the convention, delegates might be moved to nominate him as the vice presidential nominee, something that Johnson didn't want. Still, Kennedy was considering his political future. For a brief time, he considered leaving politics, but he eventually decided to run for office. He had been considering two offices, the governor of Massachusetts or senator from New York, which he eventually settled on the latter. Interestingly, Johnson was highly supportive of Kennedy's campaign. Of course, it would mean one more seat in the Senate for Johnson, and Johnson himself was still a creature of the Senate, even though he was now the chief executive. During his Senate campaign, Kennedy was criticized as being a carpetbagger by Republicans since he wasn't from New York. The campaign was bitter, and there was a possibility that he could lose. But in the end, Kennedy won the election by 10%, beating incumbent New York Senator Kenneth Keating. Now, this video is not about Kennedy's time in the US Senate, but his presidential campaign. With that being said, he mostly supported President Johnson's agenda and co-sponsored a number of bills that spanned the political spectrum. His main focus was primarily on helping poor Americans, much like his brother, Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy. When it came to Vietnam, Kennedy was a tepid supporter of Johnson, considering the Kennedy family itself is extremely staunchly anti-communist and was apparent by Bobby Kennedy's involvement with Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist crusade. But as public opinion turned, so did Bobby's opinion as well, though maybe not as quickly as some, such as Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy. Eugene McCarthy's early political career grew out of his background in academia and Minnesota's distinct progressive tradition. After earning degrees from St. John's University and the University of Minnesota, McCarthy taught economics and sociology at St. John's, where he developed a reputation as an analytical thinker who prized reasoned debate. He became active in the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party, aligning with its liberal reform wing rather than the machine politics that dominated many state organizations. In 1948, he won election to the U.S. House of Representatives, where he distinguished himself during the era of McCarthyism by openly criticizing Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist crusades, something few Democrats dared to do. In 1958, McCarthy was elected to the U.S. Senate, where he worked closely and sometimes uneasily with fellow Minnesotan Hubert Humphrey, and became known for his dry wit, intellectual independence, and skepticism towards American foreign intervention. By the time 1967 came along, there was a movement afoot to challenge Lyndon Johnson. The movement became known as the Dump Johnson movement, which mostly advocated for withdrawal from Vietnam completely. The movement was mostly made up of academics, progressive politicians, and students who had been protesting on college campuses against the war. Most prominent among these were Allard Lowenstein and Curtis Gans. Lowenstein was a lawyer and civil rights advocate, and Gans was a political scientist. Both men tried to recruit Bobby Kennedy to challenge Johnson in 1967, but Kennedy declined. They also approached others, such as South Dakota Senator George McGovern, but he also declined. The main reason why these potential candidates declined was the inevitability of Johnson's renomination as the Democratic candidate in 1968. But there was one candidate that was willing to make the sacrifice, and that was Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy. He officially entered the presidential race on November 30th, 1967. Prior to the first primary, which was to be held on March 12th, 1968 in New Hampshire, McCarthy wasn't well known to voters. In a Gallup poll conducted just after his announcement, McCarthy was only known by 42% of adults nationwide. In a head to head poll, Johnson was leading McCarthy by more than 2 to 1. One could say that Senator McCarthy's campaign was the first campaign that solidified the image of the Hollywood liberals. While most in the Democratic Party establishment stuck with the president as their political lives depended on it, McCarthy received the endorsement of Hollywood notables like Paul Newman, Barbara Streisand, Carl Reiner, Woody Allen, Dick Van Dyke, Tony Randall, and Leonard Nimoy, just to name a few. He also received the endorsement of the Americans for Democratic Action, a progressive political organization. Interestingly, the ADA shifted over the years, going from being strongly anti communist in the 1940s to being accused of being communist by Joe McCarthy in the 1950s. Yes, it does seem like any talk about 1950s politics isn't complete without mentioning Joseph McCarthy in there somewhere, which we have already done 3 times. When it came to McCarthy's campaign, his organization mostly comprised of college students and activists within the Dump Johnson movement. McCarthy did spend a lot of time in New Hampshire, but also spent a lot of time in other crucial primary states, as well as in the United States Senate in Washington, D.C. Sometimes he was even criticized by those in the campaign for spending too much time in Washington instead of on the campaign trail. Anyway, as primary day approached, Johnson's gap widened, with a Gallup poll in early February now showing the president beating McCarthy handily, receiving 71% support nationwide, with McCarthy only at 18%. In fact, Johnson's approval rating jumped from 38% in December to 48% in February. But while this poll was released in February, it was conducted in January before the Tet Offensive, a coordinated offensive attack by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army throughout South Vietnam. But even with the Tet Offensive, most people thought that it was a failed attempt and that the Americans were still in control of the Vietnam conflict. And technically, they were right, as the Tet Offensive wasn't a military victory. But when CBS reporter Walter Cronkite gave his editorial on the Vietnam War on February 27th, public opinion on the war started to shift quickly. Yes, I made a video about the so-called Cronkite moment, which you can watch in this video. Whether or not it impacted Johnson's decision from this point forward, we will never know. But one thing is for sure, and that is that the American people were moved by it. These events did seem to give McCarthy a boost, but many in the media thought that Johnson was still going to win the New Hampshire primary easily. On primary day, very few newspapers covered the Democratic primary, but instead were focused on the Republican primary and the write-in challenge from Nelson Rockefeller. But on the New Hampshire Democratic primary ballot, only McCarthy appeared, but there was also a write-in option. Johnson thought that he wouldn't have any opposition, and if he did, it wouldn't be serious. Therefore, he didn't make any serious attempt to put his name on the ballot and would be a write-in candidate, and though he hadn't yet announced, Bobby Kennedy could also be written in as a candidate. As for Kennedy, his views on Vietnam started to change quickly by the end of 1967, now being considered a staunch opponent to the Vietnam War. Still, he was in a tight spot. In fact, the New York Times on January 14th, 1968, explained the Kennedy situation perfectly, saying, quote, If he endorsed Senator McCarthy, he would be turning his back on an incumbent Democratic president, inviting the bitterest accusations of party treason, endangering the prospects of him winning the nomination himself in 1972. If he refused Mr. McCarthy, unpleasant questions were sure to be raised. If he was really sincere in his views about Vietnam, why did he not repair to McCarthy's standard? Was he placing politics above principle? Exercise at a later option, it seemed, would certainly depress in the national marketplace the value of Senator Kennedy's liberal credentials, carefully built up over the last 3 years as the party's left wing looked more and more away from President Johnson and towards some new leader. End of quote. Some even indicated that Eugene McCarthy's entry in the race was a decoy to see if Bobby Kennedy himself could make a go at it, which was the reason why Kennedy didn't endorse McCarthy, because it could lock him out of the run himself. But we would later find out that this wasn't the case. At midnight on primary day in New Hampshire, the first signs that Johnson could be in trouble started to come in. In the small town of Waterville Valley, which had only around 100 citizens, the first votes were cast in the primary. Eugene McCarthy received 8 votes, with Bobby Kennedy receiving 2 votes, and President Johnson receiving no votes. To put this in perspective, in 1964, only 1 vote was cast in the Democratic Party primary in Waterville Valley, and that went to Lyndon Johnson. McCarthy also received 1 vote in the Republican primary. While McCarthy said that there was a chance that he could win the primary, he hoped that he would eventually get over 30% of the votes. But once all the votes were counted, Eugene McCarthy received 41.9% of the votes, finishing second to President Johnson with 49.6% of write-in votes. Interestingly, Richard Nixon finished third in the primary with 4.6% of the vote, and Bobby Kennedy finished with 1.1%. And because of the rules within the New Hampshire Democratic Party, McCarthy won 20 delegates to the Democratic National Convention, while Johnson only won 4 delegates. This result was not only considered a referendum on the Vietnam War amongst Democratic voters, but also allowed Democratic politicians to voice their concerns. Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield, who was against the Vietnam War, said that McCarthy's showing was a warning signal to the White House regarding the president's Vietnam policy. And while anti-war Democratic senators did say that it was a warning, they wouldn't go as far as endorsing McCarthy's candidates. One of those senators was Bobby Kennedy. Now, to be fair, Kennedy's name for the presidency had been floated around ever since 1964, and in 1968 it wasn't any different. Many in the media assumed that Kennedy was going to run, and that McCarthy's campaign was a toe in the water to see if the temperature was just right enough for him to win. But on the night of the New Hampshire primary, Kennedy said that he still wasn't a candidate, but added the words, "at the moment." One thing that the Kennedys did at this time was to play things cautiously. Rarely did the Kennedys make the jump into electoral politics unless they knew they were going to win. And prior to the New Hampshire primary, nobody knew how strong Lyndon Johnson was. There were some who were pushing Kennedy to make an announcement before the next primary, which was in Wisconsin. One of the problems that Kennedy had was that in the next upcoming primaries, he had missed the deadline to have his name placed on the ballot. The first primary that he would be able to actually have his name placed on the ballot would be in Indiana on May 7th, less than 2 months away. And if Kennedy didn't enter the race soon, he was turning over all of the primaries to McCarthy. But there were some, like brother Senator Ted Kennedy, who advised Bobby not to run and to wait until 1972, when there was a clear Democratic field. But in all truth, Kennedy had already made the decision to run before the New Hampshire primary. He said that he would have entered the race if McCarthy were to drop out. But with McCarthy's strong showing, as well as knowing that he would easily be unopposed in the upcoming primaries, there was very little incentive for McCarthy to drop out. Kennedy did inform McCarthy that he was going to run before the New Hampshire primary, but also agreed to not make this announcement until after the New Hampshire primary. On March 16th, just 4 days after the New Hampshire primary, Kennedy announced that he was a Democratic candidate for the nomination for president. So, who was Kennedy's campaign team, and most importantly, how did his campaign operate? Let's address that last point first. In 1960, Robert Kennedy was his brother's campaign manager. Therefore, while not officially the campaign manager in his campaign, who was Richard Stearns, Bobby micromanaged the campaign with everything going through him first. Other notables on his campaign were Adam Walensky, Kennedy's senior speechwriter, Jeff Greenfield, who was also a speechwriter and delegate counter, Fred Dutton, a former JFK aide who would eventually be influential in building Kennedy's coalition with young minority and lower income voters, and Frank Mankiewicz, Kennedy's press secretary. Interestingly, most of John F. Kennedy's senior campaign advisors in 1960 were not part of Robert Kennedy's campaign, such as Ted Sorensen, Pierre Salinger, Kenneth O'Donnell, Dave Powers, and Larry O'Brien. And while some of these men were still supportive of Kennedy's, others, like O'Brien, were highly involved with the Johnson administration and thus owed their political careers to Johnson. Now, there are two things that I want to mention before we continue. First was that President Johnson decided not to run for re-election on March 31st, which now made this a two-way race between the two anti-war candidates, with eventual nominee Hubert H. Humphrey not entering the race until April 27th, essentially becoming the Johnson replacement. The second thing that I want to mention, and something I mentioned earlier, is that Kennedy had a lot of Democrats who didn't like him within political circles. Yes, he might have been popular with the voters, but an overwhelming majority of the delegates to the convention were picked by Democratic Party state conventions, which usually picked loyal Democrats. If there was one thing that Johnson was able to pull off between 1963 and 1968, it was to create a loyal group among those in Democratic Party establishment circles that supported his presidency and his party. Some were hawkish on the war, while others were willing to turn a blind eye to the war because either his public policy accomplishments or the help that he was able to give state Democratic parties. Remember, the 1964 election brought in a lot of Democrats west of the Mississippi River in states like Utah, Kansas, Idaho, and others who wouldn't have been there if it wasn't for Johnson's 1964 electoral landslide. And with that, we have three factions forming within the Democratic Party primary. First, we have strong anti-war advocates who usually sided with Eugene McCarthy. Second were the anti-war advocates who were still lured by the glory of the Kennedy family, who of course were supporters of Bobby Kennedy. Finally, you had the rank-and-file establishment Democrats who stayed with the party and supported Lyndon Johnson and eventually Hubert Humphrey. With the exception of Humphrey on Vietnam, who really didn't want to talk about the issue, all the candidates were nearly the same when it came to domestic policy. However, their campaign focus was drastically different. As for McCarthy, he continued to court younger college students and white progressive voters. For Kennedy, he was also able to get younger voters, but spent much more time in the Black and Hispanic communities trying to court their votes, as he knew that the California primary on June 4th would eventually be the make or break primary for his campaign. As for Humphrey, he knew that he wouldn't perform well in any primaries, mostly because he hadn't been put on the ballot in most of them. Therefore, he focused on winning delegates through traditional means by going through state Democratic parties. There is also a fourth faction that I want to mention here, but they really aren't important regarding the story of Robert Kennedy, but need to be mentioned, and that is the conservative Southern Democrats. On February 8, 1968, George Wallace announced that he was running as a third-party candidate. A number of Southern Democrats had already expressed their support for Wallace, but not all. Because of the civil rights records of all the other candidates, it was highly likely that an unpledged slate of delegates would have been selected if there had been primaries in these states. Only one Southern state, Florida, had a primary, and they picked favorite son George Smathers. The next major primary after New Hampshire was Wisconsin on April 2nd. In 1960, John F. Kennedy famously underperformed in Wisconsin. Of course, Bobby Kennedy did not qualify for the primary and had to contest it as a write-in candidate. But if Kennedy could have a strong write-in showing in Wisconsin, then this could propel his campaign in the upcoming primary states where he also was a write-in candidate. On primary night, to nobody's surprise, McCarthy won 56.2% of the votes. However, it was Lyndon Johnson, who had dropped out of the race 2 days earlier, who finished second with 34.6% of the vote, but was actually still on the ballot, unlike New Hampshire. This greatly outperformed third place Bobby Kennedy with only 6.4% as a write-in candidate. The fact that Johnson gained 1/3 of the vote, even though he was no longer a candidate, showed that a segment of the Democratic voters still had loyalty to the president. This was the sign that Humphrey needed to enter the primary 3 weeks later. The next Democratic primary was the Pennsylvania primary on April 23rd, with all of the candidates but McCarthy being write in candidates. But before the Pennsylvania primary, on April 4th, civil rights leader Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Eugene McCarthy, who was campaigning with labor leaders in San Francisco that day, said, quote, "The death of Dr. Martin Luther King is a tragedy for all Americans. Not only have his people lost a noble and great leader, but all people, especially Americans, have lost a man of peace. We can only grieve." End of quote. While McCarthy's words were sincere, they would not match the actions of Robert Kennedy. Immediately after hearing the news of the assassination, Kennedy chartered a plane for Coretta King from Atlanta to Memphis to bring her husband's body back to Atlanta for burial. Kennedy himself was in Indiana campaigning that day, first in South Bend at Notre Dame University, then to Ball State University in Muncie, and eventually ending the day in Indianapolis, where he was to have a campaign rally in a predominantly African American community. Because of security concerns and the fact that some riots had already started popping up around the country as a response to King's assassination, the Indianapolis Police Department could not guarantee the safety of Kennedy if he were to make a speech. Regardless, he did make this historic speech.
Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land, with an effort to understand, compassion, and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times. My favorite poem, my favorite poet was Aeschylus. And he once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black.
While there really isn't any data that supports this hypothesis, many have argued that Kennedy's speech helped him solidify his support in the black community. Could this be true? Possibly, but regardless, the Pennsylvania primary saw McCarthy, who was the only candidate on the Democratic ballot, dominate with 71.5% of the vote. Kennedy's write-in campaign was better than in Wisconsin at 10.9%, but was still lackluster nonetheless. The next primary, again with only McCarthy on the ballot, was Massachusetts, with McCarthy winning 49.3% in Kennedy's home state. Kennedy himself was at 27.6% as a write-in candidate, and Hubert Humphrey won 17.7%, also as a write-in candidate. Still, the media wasn't paying attention to these races, but were all focused on the Indiana primary, which was on May 7th, and the first primary in which Kennedy's name appeared on the ballot. While McCarthy was spending a lot of time around the nation, Kennedy spent a significant amount of time in Indiana. As mentioned earlier, Kennedy was campaigning in Indiana when Martin Luther King Jr. was shot, and that was more than a month before the primary election. But Kennedy wasn't the only candidate on the ballot. Of course, McCarthy was also on the ballot, but so was Indiana Governor Roger Brannigan, a favorite son candidate that was backed by the Johnson and Humphrey faction. Most of the media said that Kennedy was going to win the Democratic primary by a large margin, with others well behind. In a poll conducted in mid-April, it showed that Kennedy was at 28% to Brannigan's 17% and McCarthy 16%. However, 38% of those polls were still undecided. Kennedy's internal poll, which he released to the public, showed Kennedy at 34% to Brannigan's 33% and McCarthy at 15%. This internal poll showed it much closer, but Kennedy's campaign was confident of a large victory in Indiana, breaking the 50% mark. When the polls closed and all the votes were counted, Kennedy won 42.3% of the votes, well short of the 50% that his campaign was confident that they would receive. Governor Brannigan received 30.7% of the vote, significantly lower than expected. McCarthy won 27% of the votes, which was a strong showing for McCarthy. Of course, this was a Kennedy victory, but it showed that he was far from being the clear frontrunner in the Democratic primary, especially when Hubert Humphrey was not on the ballot and only represented by a favorite son. But what might even be more important was the strong showing of McCarthy. As the campaign progressed, those who considered the Vietnam War their most salient issue started gravitating strongly toward McCarthy, while those who were focused on civil rights and working class issues started gravitating toward Kennedy. While Kennedy's speeches still talked about Vietnam, it was becoming a secondary issue of the campaign. This was apparent by his strong showing in the Washington, D.C. primary on the same day as Indiana, with Kennedy winning 62.5% of the vote to Humphrey's 37.5%. McCarthy's name was not on the ballot. Still, the Vietnam War was becoming the main issue during the Democratic primary, leading to McCarthy continuing to perform well. The next important Democratic primary was in Nebraska on May 14th. As with Indiana, both Kennedy and McCarthy's names appeared on the ballot. Interestingly, Lyndon Johnson's name was still on the ballot, with Hubert Humphrey being a write-in candidate. As with Indiana, Kennedy needed to win over 50% in order to be seen as a viable candidate. Of course, this had to do with the popularity amongst the electorate, but it was also a matter of winning delegates. With McCarthy's early entry into the race and Humphrey having non-pledged delegates with Lyndon Johnson's Democratic machine, Kennedy needed to show that he was electable in order to get delegates to break away from McCarthy and Humphrey at the convention. It was now a delegate numbers game and not just a popularity contest. With that being said, Kennedy would go on to win the Nebraska primary with 51.7% of the vote, with McCarthy only winning 31.5% of the votes. Even with this result, McCarthy would go on to continue his campaign. And why not? In all honesty, this was his first major loss, and with having only a few weeks to go until California, his volunteer-based campaign could easily continue until the make-or-break California primary. But before the California primary, the Oregon primary was on May 28th. When it came to Oregon, McCarthy was in a position of advantage. First of all, because McCarthy had been campaigning for a while, he had been organizing in Oregon for over 6 months, while Kennedy's campaign wasn't nearly as organized. The second thing was that the issues that McCarthy was campaigning on was more attuned to the liberals in Oregon, which were the white anti-war progressives that he had been courting for months. Kennedy even admitted as much when he said that Oregon was basically a large suburb and that he did better in those areas that were rural and urban. Still, like other states, Kennedy spent a lot of time campaigning in Oregon. And as with other states, Kennedy's campaign message continued to focus more on domestic issues than the war in Vietnam. Because many of the white progressives in Oregon were financially well off, the issues of civil rights and poverty fell on deaf ears, unlike the Vietnam issue. Still, Kennedy signaled that it was going to be an uphill battle, thinking that he was a long shot in the Oregon primary. Even though the dynamics in Oregon made it apparent that McCarthy was going to win Oregon, the national attention wasn't focused on Oregon, but Bobby's electability against Richard Nixon. A series of Gallup polls showed that Kennedy would lose to Nixon and Wallace in the general election. Furthermore, both McCarthy and Kennedy were performing the exact same in the national polls, with both candidates at 38% to Nixon's 41% in April. The Kennedy campaign would combat these numbers with Pierre Salinger, who had now joined the Kennedy campaign as publicity director, saying that their internal polls, as well as those conducted by Lou Harris, showed Kennedy beating Nixon. The Kennedy campaign even went as far as saying that McGovern and Humphrey's campaigns had teamed up to start a Stop Bobby movement, considering both men were from the same state and that both served in the U.S. Senate together. However, there really has never been any proof of this whatsoever. McCarthy would go on to win the Oregon primary with 44% of the vote to Kennedy's 38%. While this was a McCarthy win, it might not have been as impressive as some might have thought. Still, the headlines focus on the fact that Kennedy had lost his first face-to-face battle against McCarthy, showing that his electability was highly in question. And because Oregon was a winner-take-all primary state, McCarthy continued to increase his pledged delegate total. This was a problem for Kennedy, as any unpledged delegates who were Kennedy loyalists in the past might consider jumping ship over to Humphrey if they didn't see Kennedy as a viable candidate. For example, Kansas Governor Robert Docking, who was a strong supporter of John Kennedy in 1960, refused to endorse any candidate in 1968. And this wasn't uncommon, as many former JFK supporters were quiet when it came to Bobby, as they were still seeing how it played out. The next big primary state was, of course, California. California gave voters only three choices, which were Bobby Kennedy, Eugene McCarthy, and uncommitted, which was the only way for Humphrey supporters to show their support, as Humphrey himself was not on the ballot. But what made California so important was that it was a winner-take-all state. Whoever won the primaries, even by the slightest of margins, would win all of California's 172 delegates. Both campaigns saw opportunities in California. For McCarthy, many of the anti-war protests were based out of California, especially in the Bay Area. Much of the white liberal vote would probably also go to McCarthy. As for Kennedy, he did have a lock on many prominent voices in California politics. As for the white anti-war liberals, California Speaker of the House, Jesse Unruh, one of the most prominent Democrats in California, supported Kennedy. As far as the black community, many grassroots organizations, as well as LA City Councilman Tom Bradley, were backers of Kennedy. As for the Latinos, Cesar Chavez, the leader of the United Farm Workers, an organization that sought to protect the labor and civil rights of migrant workers, supported Kennedy. In fact, as soon as Kennedy announced that he was running for president, he joined Cesar Chavez in breaking a fast that Chavez had started 25 days earlier during the Delano grape strike. And while McCarthy did have his Hollywood elites on his side, Kennedy had his fair share of elites as well, such as Shirley MacLaine, Milton Berle, Gene Kelly, Henry Fonda, Aretha Franklin, Tony Curtis, Sammy Davis Jr., and a ton of others supporting Kennedy. One area where it was a little sticky was support within unions. The AFL-CIO did not back Kennedy in California and instead backed Humphrey's nomination. And even though the umbrella union did not back Kennedy, individual unions could break with the AFL-CIO to support Kennedy. One of those was the United Auto Workers, who was represented by Paul Schrady in California. As with previous primaries held up to this point, McCarthy focused on Vietnam while Kennedy focused on civil rights and economic issues. Still, going into primary day, it was anyone's guess who would win. Kennedy did have the lead in a poll before the primary election day done by Oliver Quayle Company, showing Kennedy with 39% to McCarthy's 30%. As votes started to come in, McCarthy had the lead, but it wasn't enough to keep him in the lead once Los Angeles County started counting. Once that happened, Kennedy took the lead and wouldn't look back. Once all the votes were counted, he would win all of California's delegates, making a strong argument for his candidacy at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago.
So I thank all of you who made this possible this evening, all of the effort that you made, and all of the people whose names I haven't mentioned, but who did all of the work at the precinct level, who got out the vote, who did all of the effort, brought forth all of the effort that's required. I was a campaign manager 8 years ago. I know what a difference that kind of an effort and that kind of commitment makes. So I thank all of you, those of you who are here. Mayor Yorty has just sent me a message that we've been here too long already. So my thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you very much.
Team of 6 neurosurgeons will start to operate on Senator Kennedy in about 5 or 10 minutes. He has one superficial shoulder wound and one very critical wound, a bullet which entered the right mastoid bone behind the right ear and has gone to the midline of the skull. That bullet is lodged in his brain, and they will operate within a very few minutes in an attempt to remove it. Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m. today, June 6, 1968. With Senator Kennedy, at the time of his death, were his wife Ethel, his sisters Mrs. Stephen Smith, and Mrs. Patricia Lawford, brother-in-law Mr. Stephen Smith, and his sister-in-law Mrs. John F. Kennedy. He was 42 years old.
Obviously, at this point, his campaign ceased to exist. Still, he did have delegates going to the convention on his behalf. Many of those delegates started a Draft Ted Kennedy movement, but he declined any attempts to secure him the nomination. Eventually, South Dakota Senator George McGovern became the candidate for the Kennedy faithful, hoping that Humphrey would be stopped on the first ballot. There was then talk that if Humphrey was stopped on the first ballot, then Ted Kennedy might consider the Democratic nomination. But in the end, Humphrey ended up securing the nomination on the first ballot. Now that we've come to the end of this video, I want to address the question of, would Kennedy have been president? Now, I know this is an unpopular view, but asking whether Kennedy would have beaten Nixon is absolutely putting the cart before the horse. there's very little evidence that Kennedy would have won the Democratic nomination, much less the general election. And with all of the evidence that we have, from polling data to how the delegation split during the convention, it's more unlikely than likely that Kennedy would have become the nominee. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, the polls had Kennedy behind Nixon, even though it was close. Throughout the decades, I think that there has been some sort of glorification of Robert Kennedy's 1968 presidential campaign. Once he was shot, he, like his brother, became a saint-like figure, with people thinking that he would have won the election. In 1964, John Kennedy would have probably won, and the polls in 1963 indicated that he was headed toward a landslide election, which is what actually happened, but with Lyndon Johnson. So we have some data with John F. Kennedy in 1964, but with Robert Kennedy, there is really nothing that supports the claims that he would have been elected president. I wouldn't go as far as saying that it's a myth, but I would say that it is an uncertainty that nobody truly knows the answer. And with that, we are at the end of today's video. Thank you very much for watching. Remember, you can join my Patreon with the link below in the description. Again, thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.